Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this Investor Alliance for Human Rights webinar on artificial intelligence and human rights due diligence. My name is Paloma Munoz, and I am the director of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. So for those of you who are perhaps less familiar with the Alliance, our goal is to provide a collective action platform for responsible investment that is grounded in respect for people's fundamental rights. Our members are based across 4 continents and represent 3.5 trillion in assets under management. Our diverse membership includes asset managers, public and private pension funds, trade union funds, faith-based organizations, foundations, and family funds. Along with civil society allies, we equip the investment community with expertise and opportunities to put the investor responsibility to respect human rights into practice. We do this 3 ways. First, by providing tools and resources for investor action on human rights. Second, by supporting direct engagement with portfolio companies on their own human rights practices. And lastly, by coordinating advocacy that asks policymakers as well as standard-setting bodies to create a level playing field for responsible business. So this webinar in particular forms part of the Investor Alliance's efforts to promote the uptake of human rights due diligence among, and not just human rights due diligence, rather the uptake of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights among companies in the ICT sector. So much of the work so far in this collective effort on ICT has really concentrated on developing tools and guidance on a number of companies, as well as on a range of salient human rights issues to support investor engagement with ICT companies. In this process, a common theme that keeps coming up in the research and in consultations with civil society and affected rights holders around the world is AI. And how it can and does magnify the adverse impacts that companies can have on human rights, including privacy, freedom of expression, and non-discrimination. So recognizing the real world impacts of AI that AI can have on people, a number of investors have started tackling AI risks in their engagements, including by filing shareholder resolutions on AI. For example, 2 shareholder resolutions were filed with Amazon in December over its sales of facial recognition technology to the US government. One resolution asked Amazon to halt sales of recognition to government unless the board concluded that the technology did not pose actual or potential civil and human rights risks. And the other resolution requested the board commission an independent study of recognition regarding the extent to which the technology may endanger, threaten, or violate privacy and or civil rights. So given the reach of AI across sectors and the scale of associated impacts, Alliance members who are actively engaged in our work in our ICT working group identified the need to promote the uptake of human rights due diligence in the development and in the use of AI as a priority for the work ahead, which brings us to where we are today and to this webinar. Really, the goal of the webinar is to help inform investors of the ways that they can promote respect for human rights in the context of AI. So we're very excited to have with us today Dunstan Allison Hope, Managing Director of BSR. He is our guest expert speaker. Dunstan brings significant experience working on a diverse range of issues with companies across various sectors, and has particular expertise on technology and human rights, privacy and freedom of expression, sustainability reporting, and stakeholder engagement. So welcome, Dunstan. We're also fortunate to have Danielle Essink, Senior Engagement Specialist at Robeco and member of the Investor Alliance's Steering Committee, to help us lead this discussion. So before handing it off to Danielle to get us started, just a couple housekeeping notes. First, we are recording this webinar and we'll share the link to the recording in the coming days. The second piece of updates or housekeeping is that everyone is muted right now, and you will be muted throughout the presentation. But if you do have questions, please raise your hand on the little hand icon on the left side of the screen, or the other option is to type your question in the questions box on the right-hand side, and I'll read that out later. So I think with that, I will ask Danielle to get us started.
Thanks, Paloma, and thanks all for joining. Just a small introduction to myself and my role in the Alliance. I work in Robeco, which is a Dutch asset manager with about 180 billion assets under management in euros. I'm part of Robeco's active ownership team as a human rights specialist, which means in effect that my day-to-day job is to analyze and engage with companies on human rights issues. I've worked quite a lot in the ICT sector the past 4 years on topics like privacy and freedom of expression. And in this year, we've broadened that scope with 2 topics. One is AI, that's why I'm here today, but also we're looking more into children's rights online in collaboration with CBIS. So why did we decide to look at AI? In our holdings, we have quite a lot of tech companies, and we see them obviously using a lot of AI. We see the uptake increasing almost day by day. And we note a lot of the positive impacts that AI can bring to companies and people, but we also want to understand the potential negative social impacts of AI and the way our portfolio companies are using it. One example that we've used a lot internally also to explain how AI can have both positive and negative impacts is one that you read about a lot, facial recognition, where on the one hand, we see the positive impacts that facial recognition technology can have, for example, by identifying victims of sexual exploitation. But on the other hand, you read a lot of news around the fact that it's not really reliable. So there's one article that always stands out for me where the US Congress is scanned or goes through this facial recognition technology, and that you see that actually there's a lot of false recognition there. So they're apparently matched to people in an arrest database, which doesn't make any sense. So how much can we actually trust this technology, and how does things like bias and privacy play a role there? That's really what we want to understand better. What we're currently doing is a research piece on the topic. We're trying to set a framework on how to assess companies on their use and application of AI. And that's actually been quite a challenge. There's not really a set framework out there. There's a lot of articles and reports about AI, both positive, more negative, or critical. But there's not really one clear set of guidelines that we can actually use as an investor. Also, there's not really clear regulation at the moment that we can address or use. And what we're really trying to identify is, can we use human rights due diligence as a framework for assessing companies' use of AI? We came across 3 very interesting reports by BSR, by Dunstan, that really suggest a human rights-based approach to artificial intelligence. And I'm very happy that we have Dunstan today on the call to help us understand that in more detail. So Dunstan, really a few questions to you. Can you really start us off with the basics? So what is AI? What are the potential human rights impacts? And also your key recommendation when it comes to artificial intelligence and human rights.
Great, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I greatly appreciate it. Starting with facial recognition, that's a picture of me on the slide, and I appear to be wearing the same shirt. So I'm well suited for the facial recognition software to identify me, at least. And I should say my co-author of those 3 reports, Mark Hodge, is also on the line. So welcome, Mark, and it was a great pleasure to co-author those 3 reports with you. So we have gained a lot of experience over the past year or so undertaking human rights due diligence with technology companies looking at AI. What I thought I'd open with is 3 key messages that we're taking to our member companies on artificial intelligence, just to get the discussion going, and then I'll address that question about sort of what are some of the key impacts and what is AI. But I thought I'd start with the 3 key messages. So if we go to the first slide, and they're key, so I'll keep them fairly short. So the first message we're sharing is that human rights-based methodologies offer a robust framework for the responsible development and use of AI and should form an essential part of business policy and practice. So that statement sounds quite obvious, sounds fairly straightforward, but really what we're saying here is that you'll hear a lot about ethics in AI and companies publishing ethics-based policies on AI. And that's fine, and it's good as far as it goes, but we would say that that's not sufficient, and that a human rights-based approach is essential to take. So human rights provide a long list of potential impacts that should be considered very systematically. They're granted in international law and standards and policy. There's something much more robust about taking a human rights-based approach compared to just relying on ethics. If you go to the second slide, this is something that is becoming more important to us the more work we do on AI and human rights, which is that companies outside the technology industry have an essential role to play and should be much more proactively involved in the development of responsible approaches to AI. So I mentioned we're doing a lot of human rights due diligence for technology companies on artificial intelligence. And what becomes very clear the moment we get into that work is the human rights impacts that we're looking at vary significantly from use case to use case, from application to application, and from industry to industry. And in fact, lots of the decisions that are made about how AI is deployed and what sort of human rights impact it may have rest not just with the technology company, but actually with the retailer, with the transport and logistics company, with the government agency, with the healthcare company, with the entertainment company that's actually using AI. So there's been a lot of focus on the technology industry for very, very good reason. But our sense is that we need to focus on the non-technology industries that are actually deploying AI, because that's where a lot of the most important decisions will be made. And then the third key point, if you go to the next slide, is that innovative methods of human rights due diligence are needed that uncover blind spots, imagine unintended consequences, and anticipate a highly uncertain future. So we've worked with companies to do human rights due diligence over many years, decades, and often you're dealing with sort of known impacts. You can look at a company's operations, get a good sense of what the impacts are. Here we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unintended consequences, a lot of unknowns. And so we've realized that actually the way you do human rights due diligence needs to change. We're deploying scenario-based, futures-based methodologies that are intended to identify potential impacts of the future, not just the known impacts today, look at some crazy scenarios that might sound completely off the wall, but actually it turns out the things that might actually happen. So in our human rights due diligence with companies, we're trying to be really imaginative and creative in how we facilitate discussions that get at some of those unintended consequences and blind spots. I think you mentioned, some basic questions about what is AI and what are some of the main impacts. I'm probably not the best person to answer the question, what is AI, but I'll read from our reports. I tend to think of AI as intelligence exhibited by machines. Intelligence exhibited by machines includes both machine learning, so using algorithms to parse data, learn from data, make a determination, make a prediction, make a decision, but also deep learning, which is inspired by the biology of the human brain and a sort of more sophisticated way of learning. So you can look at the formal definitions of AI. I think for the work that we do, what I find most useful to really keep in mind is it's a very broad technology, and it covers a wide range of different use cases, a wide range of different impacts. And when we talk about what human rights impacts are relevant for AI, there are some obvious ones that one sort of jumps to right away around freedom of expression, around privacy, around security. But actually, as I mentioned, there are lots of different use cases, and the human rights impacts can really be quite diverse depending on which industry and which use case you're looking at. So you might look at freedom of movement, you might look at access to public services and healthcare. The impacts are actually quite broad and sometimes surprising, and that's why a human rights-based approach is very important to take, because a lot of these human rights are very interrelated and interlinked. So the right to freedom of expression, for example, the right to freedom of movement is very directly linked to the right to privacy, for example. So it's understanding the links between different human rights impacts and understanding the full range of them, rather than just focusing on a few like privacy that we found to be an important part of our approach. Anyway, those are some key messages. I'm looking forward to the discussion and the Q&A, and let's get into it.
So maybe a first question from my side, Dunstan, before we open up to the broader group. I was wondering, in your experience with companies, because obviously in the end investors are going to be talking about this to specific companies. To what extent have they really started to develop human rights policies and due diligence approaches that actually incorporate also their use of AI?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. So we're seeing a good take-up of ethics policies and human rights policies or human rights-based approaches among some of the large high-profile technology brands, right? So you've seen the Google AI principles, for example, has a good reference to human rights in them. You see the work that Microsoft does. So there's a good take-up among the technology companies, and there are increasingly thoughtful approaches to human rights due diligence that do take a very good look at the use phase. So they are very clearly looking at what are the different use cases and what types of human rights impacts might arise from the use of this AI. That is where it becomes quite difficult, because there are so many different unintended consequences, and those impacts during the use phase arise based on how the retailer might use facial recognition, or based on how the transport logistics company might use facial recognition, or based on how the entertainment industry might use AI. And so that's why I was making the point that we've seen a lot less in other industries, and that's where I think progress needs to be made in many, many different places on this agenda. It's very, very early stage. But I would love to see companies in other industries putting forward human rights-based approaches and policies on AI. I think that's where the urgency lies.
Okay, so it's really about the complete value chain you mentioned. That's everybody in that value chain needs to play its role and take its responsibility. That's a very interesting thought. You already mentioned two companies, I think Google and Microsoft. I was wondering if there are specific examples where you feel companies are really showing good practice, or it's not always very popular to mention the ones where it goes wrong, but I think it would really be helpful to understand what you see as good examples that we can, as investors, look at and then try to incorporate our thoughts in our engagement conversations with the whole sector. Yeah,
so the good news and bad news is I can't really speak to individual companies, because often we're working under confidentiality agreements and that type of thing. I would say that Google and Microsoft are two that stand out as companies that have been most proactive on these issues. There are interesting developments in Japan too. So if you look at companies like NEC, like Fujitsu, like Sony, there are lots of companies involved in the AI industry in Japan that have also been putting out AI ethics, in particular AI human rights policies and approaches. And what I might do is reference a few things that we've noticed, best practices that we are seeing among companies. And when we work with companies to undertake human rights due diligence on AI, there are a few things that keep coming back to us as some of the best practices that companies can put forward, at least technology companies. So one is around acceptable use policies. So being clear about what it is that this AI can and should be used for, and more importantly, what it shouldn't be used for. So one of the features we've been looking for as a best practice feature is what are the acceptable use policies that that company puts in place for that AI. That's one piece of leverage that I think exists with best practice. The second is around blacklisting or whitelisting who you do and don't sell to, right? So I mentioned how the use phase is extremely important. The companies that are leading in this field are ones that are thinking intelligently about who do we not sell our products to, or for that matter, who do we really want to sell our products to? What are the use cases we're really trying to emphasize and go after? And then finally, ones that are really trying to provide training and guidance on best practices, or put forward ideas, concepts, thoughts on public policy, on laws and regulatory frameworks. So companies that are being thoughtful on, and I think you'll see a lot more of this over the next 12 months or so being thoughtful about what regulatory frameworks are needed for AI. So some of the big brands that you've mentioned, I think, are good examples of that, or early stage examples of that in formation. I think we'll see more of those best practices emerge as time goes by. But those are the features that we're noticing of best practice.
Okay, thanks. That's very helpful. Are there, besides your own reports, any specific guidance documents that you would advise investors to use, or any recommendations you would have for us as a group? As a final question before we open up to the broader floor.
Yeah, there are a few, and this is a field where a lot is being written. So one could spend a very large amount of time reading AI and ethics and human rights reports. So I've written down a few that I think are tremendously useful. So one is IEEE. IEEE have had a whole process to establish new standards on ethics and AI. It's called ethically aligned design. Human rights is one of the early principles in that document. So IEEE is definitely a good place to look at in terms of standards. AI Now puts out some very, very thoughtful material on this. They publish annual reports on the state of AI. The most recent one I found extremely insightful. They also published one recently on discrimination in AI that was linking the lack of diversity in the technology industry with some of the discrimination issues that exist with AI. That was very good. The Partnership on AI is obviously one of the main multi-stakeholder initiatives in this field, and they will be the source of increasing amounts of good literature and learning. The Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, they published, I'm going to get the title wrong, so apologies if anybody's on the phone from Berkman Klein Center, but they published a great report, I think late last year, looking at the human rights impact of, I think, 6 different use cases of AI. I thought that was very thoughtful, the way it looked across the whole value chain, looked across the full range of different human rights. And then there's an organization called Upturn, based in DC, that have been producing some really interesting detailed studies on particular AI use cases. The two that spring to mind for me is AI in human resources, and how artificial intelligence is used during the hiring phase, for example, to shortlist candidates, help companies during the interview process. They put out a really, really good report called Help Wanted that would be a great read. And more recently put out something on targeted advertising and how targeted advertising can have all sorts of discriminatory outcomes. And what I was really impressed by their work is the way in which it didn't sort of just start with the big picture. It really went into some detail about how AI is deployed, right? And if you're going to do human rights due diligence of AI, you really need to get into that detail, and they did that extremely well. So IEEE, AI Now, Partnership on AI, Berkman Klein Center, and Upturn are the ones that bubble to the surface to me.
Great, thanks a lot. One last follow-up question, sorry about that. Is really, it just came to mind when you went through all these resources. I've read a few of them, so I'll definitely look out for the other ones. What would, based on your experience and reading, be the top, let's say, top 2 or top 3 questions we should ask companies to assess if they really get this right in a way?
I think it would depend on which company you're talking to. So for the technology industry, well, let me start by saying you can ask all the questions about policy and human rights due diligence, right? So does the company have a policy? Does the company undertake human rights due diligence? And is it committed to transparency? All of those questions are extremely important. So policy, human rights due diligence, access to remedy, transparency, you know, the building blocks of a human rights-based approach. Asking all of those questions is extremely important. I think in the technology industry, I would look at questions around acceptable use policies, in their restrictions on how the technology is used. I would look at whitelisting and blacklisting. How are they thinking through who they do and don't sell the technology to? And I would be asking about public policy regulatory frameworks. And in fact, as investors, the latter one is especially important. I'd have thought as investors, you don't want to be investing in companies or industries that might get, or use cases that might get regulated out of existence, right? There are companies that are pushing at the boundaries of what's socially acceptable and could be investing in technologies or business models that become regulated out of existence. So I think asking about the regulatory question. But then thinking about the tech companies, asking them, have they really thought through the impact? Well, have they first of all identified how they're using AI, but then have they thought through what impact the use of AI might have on their existing human rights risks and opportunities? So assuming a retailer or a transport company or a bank has an existing list of salient issues, they have an existing human rights plan to address those issues, have they really looked at whether AI is going to change any of those things? Because it almost certainly will. And then one final thought, this discussion has been based on AI. There's lots of good reason for that. I would encourage us to think about disruptive technology more broadly. So the Internet of Things, for example, 5G, blockchain, there's actually a full range of disruptive technologies that will change the human rights impact profile of the companies that you're investing in. So asking about AI is terrific, but it's an opportunity actually to broaden the discussion into disruptive technologies overall.
That's a very interesting thought. Thanks, thanks for that. And maybe we can explore that when we open the floor for the broader group.
Yeah, we already have a few questions lined up. I'm happy to read those out now. First, we have one from Henry Wiener. I think he's asking, it would be helpful to distribute the list of documents and organizations mentioned, and I'll answer that. We will do that in our follow-up email, where we'll also include a link to this recording. So we'll send you the links in follow-up to this discussion. Alison Bertet is asking about your thoughts on recent guidelines on trustworthy AI that were published by the EU Commission Expert Group. And although it references fundamental human rights, it is an ethics-based framework. Do you see regulation legislation ultimately being necessary and desirable in the space, so to provide clarity for business and or compel improved performance?
Mm-hmm. Right, so first of all, on the EU guidelines, I have read them, but I haven't worked closely with them. So for example, I think it has a checklist for companies to use. I've not had direct experience in using it. I would say one thing, although I've said an ethics-based approach isn't sufficient, we need a human rights-based approach, there are lots of good reasons for considering ethics as well. It's an and rather than an or. So there are all sorts of questions one can get at through an ethics-based framework in terms of distributive justice, for example, or different decisions where different organizations or different individuals might have two different points of view as to what the right thing to do is, but both might be consistent with human rights. There's all sorts of reasons why an ethics-based approach is also important. And it's good to see that those questions of ethics are being brought forward by the European Union. So I think it's part of the positive trend towards some very deliberate thinking about how we deploy AI. And in fact, I would just contrast this with where we were 12, 15 years ago when issues of internet censorship and privacy were first raised. The controversy about filtered search results in China, for example. Back then, there was very little to look at, very little to read when thinking through what should a company do? What is the right thing for, in that case, a Google or Microsoft, Yahoo to do? It was a very empty space. These days, there are lots and lots of guidelines and standards like the European Union document, and that's to be celebrated. We're in such a much more positive situation now, where there's so much thought going into this. There's so much to build upon and read and learn from, and the European Union guidelines are part of that. When it comes to regulation, I would say absolutely yes. I'm a strong believer that there has to be regulation around all sorts of disruptive technologies. For a wide variety of reasons. A few that spring to mind are the free rider problem or the substitutability problem. So one company may choose not to sell AI products and services to certain types of customers, and that's good for that company. But that's not going to stop another company doing the same thing, right? That's not going to stop another company selling AI or choosing to deploy it in a certain way. And so the impact on human rights ultimately would be the same. So we need laws and regulations to address system-wide issues that one company alone isn't going to address. Facial recognition is a classic example of that. Absolutely needs to be a regulatory framework there. I would say that I don't think one can regulate disruptive technology or AI as a whole. We need to look at individual industries, individual use cases, individual risks that need to be mitigated. So it's a question of looking at what's right for each scenario. Also, it's worth looking at how existing laws apply. So when you look at discrimination in AI in the US, there's all sorts of employment law that applies, and it applies regardless of AI. And so there's a lot of regulation there in existence already that we need to think about how it's used. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. So we have another question from Sam Jones. He's asking whether you found particularly useful analysis concerning AI and its actual potential role in armed conflict and corresponding obligations for companies under international humanitarian law.
Yeah, I wish that I had is the answer to that question. In fact, just a slight side note, in 1999, I wrote my master's degree dissertation on exactly that topic and are fascinated by it. I have not had the opportunity to work specifically on how AI and other disruptive technologies are used in the military and in warfare, but I think that's an extremely important topic that requires much further exploration. It's also one that will raise all sorts of difficult ethical and human rights issues where different people might have a different opinion. So, countries have the right to self-defense. That requires a military. So is that a good deployment of AI or not? There are concepts of justice of war. So what wars are rights? There are concepts of justice in war. How do you fight war? AI could be used, for example, to more accurately avoid civilian targets. There are big ethical questions that need, and human rights questions that need exploration, where different people might have very different points of view. So unfortunately, I don't have any sources or reading material to recommend or experience to speak to, except to say I think it's a super important discussion. Actually, I have thought of one thing. Stanford put on an excellent session about, I'm going to say about 3 or 4 weeks ago. It was an entire day about AI and human rights, and I believe all of the sessions were recorded and may be up on the Stanford, I think it's the law school website. They had a really good panel on exactly this, and it was a 2-hour panel, and I've never found a 2-hour panel entertaining before in my life, but this one kept me engaged throughout the entire time. So if Stanford have uploaded the video from that panel, it'd be extremely good. They had people who've been responsible for Project Maven on the panel. They had people who've been campaigning against the use of AI in the military on the panel. So it really brought those issues to the fore.
Great, that's very helpful. Okay, great. We have a question now from Mary Beth Gallagher. So what should be our expectations for monitoring and oversight of acceptable use policies? So have you seen instances where these are effective at mitigating human rights risks? That's the second question.
So have acceptable use policies been effective, and what type of oversight? Yeah, I think it's a really good question to which there is not yet an answer. So the question of how does a company enforce acceptable use policies is one that we are exploring right now, and we do not have an answer, right? So it's one thing for a company to say, here's our acceptable use policy, all customers have to sign it. That creates a sort of legal distance, that if the customer uses the product in the way that they've said they won't, there's legal distance there. But there's no guarantee that the acceptable use policy is going to be followed. And this question about how does one enforce an acceptable use policy, I haven't seen, don't have to hand good practice examples right now. Some of the things we've been thinking about are what types of communications channels are made available to surface examples of non-compliance, and what type of response mechanisms does the company have in place to respond to non-compliance issues as they come up. We've explored ideas of, for example, repeat licensing of a product. So an acceptable use policy is signed when you buy the product, when you buy the license. What if there's a renewal process where maybe you have to sign every couple of years? Are there certain higher risk scenarios where the company should do spot checks and audit whether a company is applying the acceptable use policy? These are all ideas we're kicking around right now. These are not things that we've seen and I could share right now. In terms of oversight, I think that is again a significant work in progress. I think we have definitely, how should I say, there's been a lot said about the need for multidisciplinary approaches, right? To have people with ethics backgrounds, sociology backgrounds, policy backgrounds, engineers, all working together to fully understand the impact of AI. I think that's absolutely right, and people who are very familiar with specific applications and use cases. I've not seen an oversight model to speak of that necessarily works right now, but one would need to design it to involve a wide range of different disciplines. And I think really, if you think about a human rights-based approach, vulnerable populations, marginalized groups, rights holders who may be particularly impacted or those that can represent them are going to be especially important. A rights-based approach requires one to really think through those cases deliberately. But I couldn't sit here and say, here's an independent board or an oversight body that's been effective, because I'm not aware of one at the moment.
Okay. Are there any other questions on the line? Okay, I'll just follow up briefly on that that question in particular, because I think one of the things that we see in terms of some of the engagements that members have been having is companies starting to realize the importance of including diversity in the engineering teams themselves, with the hope and intent that that will make algorithmic bias a little bit, I guess, less, reduce it. But I think one of the challenges has been in some of the conversations is, to what extent are companies thinking about actually including people with human rights expertise within the team that's developing, so one thing is a bit of an oversight mechanism, but I think at the moment of developing, or engineers have the skills that have training to understand this, that's another question, and from what I've heard, it doesn't seem to be a consideration yet. Is that something you've heard of specifically around the engineering team and their capacity on human rights?
Yeah, I think it's actually a super important question, the one you just raised. So we have had some experience recently delivering human rights training to engineers and product managers at a couple of technology companies. In fact, a handful of technology companies. And it's gone extremely well. They've been hungry for greater knowledge of human rights. And something one person from the engineering profession said to me, and I'm not an engineer, I studied history originally, so I'm not an engineer myself. They said engineers are very keen on things that are clearly defined, where there's a clear right or wrong, where there's a clear good or bad, where it's based on international law, international standards. And so there's this predisposition to be in favor of human rights because it has all of those characteristics, right? There are international covenants that set out what human rights actually are, and so they tend to be quite well received. So the training that we've done has gone quite well. I think the other thing that I would add to your question is around the role of engineers in human rights due diligence. So if you think about working with large companies, lots of different technologies, lots of different products, lots of different use cases, lots of different customers. There's no way like an outside organization like ourselves or the central corporate responsibility human rights team can do due diligence for all of that, right? They need to establish the systems, the mechanisms, the processes, such that engineers, product designers, data scientists are thinking about human rights in the work that they do and have processes to follow that fully incorporate human rights. And that's the other thing that that we've sort of been thinking about alongside that training. It's not just training the engineers or product managers in what are human rights, what are the UN guiding principles, but also thinking through what processes are actually going to work for them that are going to integrate human rights into decision making. And that is very much a work in progress. And we would love to see, I feel like we've just scratched the surface of what needs to take place on those things.
Thanks, Denson. That's really interesting. Can I ask you another question that's maybe a little bit more focused on the human rights due diligence experience that you have? I recall a very interesting panel at the UN Forum last year in Geneva. That was more privacy focused, but it explains how difficult it can be to do a human rights due diligence on privacy, because it doesn't have any borders, products go worldwide. Mm-hmm. I can only imagine that for AI, it's also pretty complicated. What are for you the main takeaways on how this is done, how it works, and maybe also relating to some sort of questions we as investors can ask mm-hmm. to assess whether this human rights due diligence is actually effective?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the thing that springs to mind, both in terms of how it's done and what you can ask, revolves around the unintended use consequences. The unintended use cases and the unintended consequences. So the question would be to the company, have you thought through, have you compiled the list of unintended consequences or negative outcomes that may result from the use of this technology? Right, so companies will often be thinking through, I'm designing this particular product, either with a positive use case in mind, here's the great thing I want this product to do, or just thinking I'm designing the technology and putting it out there for others to use. So asking the question, have they thought through the unintended use consequences would be an important question. But to your point about how to do human rights due diligence, I mean, there are all the basic elements of human rights due diligence that apply. But the two things that we've found are important to sort of emphasize in an artificial intelligence context is, first of all, the futures-based approach that I mentioned. So we've been running essentially workshops that take some sort of imaginative version of the future. So it might be self-driving cars are ubiquitous in every major city, or it might be surveillance cameras are ubiquitous in every particular city. Take a particular scenario, a particular status of the image of the future, and then work out what are the human rights consequences that might arise from that. What are the first order consequences? What are the second order? What are the third order? And get out of thinking about this specific product, but looking, trying to broaden our horizons as to how the products or the technology might be used. And they've been great fun, but also a good way of broadening our horizons and making sure that longer term perspectives are built into how the company thinks about the technology. And even though it might sound like a sort of fairly informal workshop, and we've been with companies who have ended up saying, you know what, we don't want this technology to be deployed in this particular market segment. So we're going to make it available for this group of companies, not this other group of companies. And that's, that's a very important outcome from something that's actually sort of a creative, fun workshop setting.
Great.
Thanks. That's really interesting.
We have a couple questions from Tracy Rembert. First is that she shares that she had a debate with a colleague yesterday about how early to engage people going into the tech sector on the real skills they need to code and build new tech tools in the future. And sort of the kind of conclusion being that it's too late to do that in college. So coding camps are happening in middle school. So what's the role of companies in fostering broader skill sets for coders and AI developers at the start, is one question. And then she follows that with, should companies also have advisory committees with ethical, diversity, bias, sociology, expertise to oversee launch of new tools?
Right, just writing it down. So on the role of companies in education, it's not one I'm an expert in. In other words, I can't speak to particular cases. But I would say, first of all, I'm generally in favor of the education system keeping up with the times and there being methods of training people on not just technology, but the ethics, social, human rights issues arising from technology in the education system. I'm personally a fan of multidisciplinary approaches. I feel like we suffer from having created a world in which you choose your profession, you stick to that profession. So people will work for a company for their entire career, or people will work in government for their entire career, or they'll work for an NGO for their entire career. I'm in favor of career paths where people move from sector to sector, and I feel like the same is true in education. We've created this very sort of narrow approach to education where broader, more holistic, cross-disciplinary approaches are needed. And so I think that's beyond the role of the company, right? That's a societal-wide government policy question about what education system is suitable for the future. And in fact, I would have some hesitation about saying it's too much of a role for companies in an education system. You know, there's some risks and dangers in that, it would seem to me. The other question was about diversity in oversight boards and advisory bodies, is that right?
Sorry, on mute again. Yeah, whether companies should have advisory committees with, ethical, diversity, bias, and sociology experts to oversee the launch of new tools in particular.
So overall, yes, and yes. I'm essentially a big fan of external advisory bodies or structured ways for external input into company processes, and for that to be multidisciplinary and to draw upon a wide range of different disciplines and points of expertise. The diversity of those panels is extremely important, especially for companies that are global or that have impacts in a wide range of different societies. Not having just the HQ country groupthink is extremely important. It's fun. I haven't seen as much of that as I would have liked. So I remember working for BT in 1999 through 2004. We had an independent advisory panel. Back then, so 15, 20 years ago, it felt like these things were going to flourish, right? It felt like more and more companies were going to have external advisory boards providing input, oversight, that this was something that would take off. It hasn't really. And I wonder if now is the time to really push that model again, and maybe the technology industry is the best place to push it, given all of the broad social, ethical, human rights implications that arise from technology, and the benefit to the company decision-making process from having outside organizations, individuals participate in an early stage, so that the company's not making mistakes that it later regrets. So I'm a big fan of that, but I've not seen it as much as I would like. And then underneath, there are lots of nuts and bolts questions about how those types of panels would work. What's the level of transparency? What's the right mix of people? What's the length of term, so that they have a good understanding of the company, but on the other hand, aren't serving for so long that they lack independence? I think there are all sorts of nuts and bolts questions to get into there, but it's a model that I think the time is right for it.
Mm-hmm. Great. Another question from Allison. You mentioned that the free rider sustainability problem. Some would say we are wasting our time if China doesn't buy into responsible AI. Have you seen any uptake from China or Chinese companies on these issues?
Yeah, good question. It's the question of China and the way in which China is deploying AI weighs on my mind all the time, and I haven't figured out, what I think about it yet, and how to. Well, I know that there are huge human rights challenges at stake. What I haven't thought through is how best to address them. The Partnership on AI provides an interesting case because I believe Baidu is a member of the Partnership on AI, and they are actively seeking to engage companies and organizations from all countries, including China. So it would be worth looking at Baidu and the Partnership on AI and seeing how that unfolds. But I do fear we're going down a path of having fragmented approaches to how AI is deployed and what norms and rules and regulations apply that are very different in China, and I'm assuming some other countries, compared to, say, Western Europe, US, and other countries. And if the question is asked, you know, how should US companies be thinking about that? I really don't know yet. You know, is it better to be in China and engage, or is it better to avoid it altogether and just concentrate on other markets? I think it's a big question of our time, and deserves an entire webinar or 16 of its own.
Great. Wondering if there are any new questions, any other questions. We have about 9 minutes left, so maybe one or two tops. If not, certainly I can jump in. You know, I think one of the questions that I would have when we talk about doing human rights due diligence and the development and use of AI, you know, obviously the part of consultation and impact assessment, and how do we involve rights holders, affected rights holders, and that of course also relates to sort of effective grievance mechanisms and how you consider that in your efforts to evaluate the effectiveness of your measures and assess your impacts as well. So, I mean, I feel like you've more or less touched on this, and it seems that there isn't much out there, but you know, what do you think? How do companies that are developing this technology or using it, how should they be engaging with rights holders, affected rights holders, in the process of trying to evaluate the real and potential impacts of the AI? And related to that, you know, what could an actual, what would a good grievance mechanism look like?
Yeah, so the first question about engaging with rights holders in developing products, technologies, I would think of it in two different ways. So one is engagement with stakeholder organizations that are policy experts that have insight on behalf of different groups of rights holders. So it's sort of high policy level. What's the engagement process to involve civil society organizations, advocates that are you know, specialists in particular human rights or human rights-based approaches. But then the second bit is, how does one involve users and individual rights holders in the design and the development of the product itself? And this is an area that I think requires further thought, exploration. It's something we would love to work with member companies more on than we are today. And you know, companies are forever testing products with users, running focus groups or sessions where users work with a test product, or you know, there are processes in place to see how users respond to different technologies. Thinking through who are those users, and how do we make sure we're having a diverse range of users, that the most vulnerable and marginalized groups are having an opportunity to participate in those types of processes. That's worthy of exploration. That's very different than the sort of policy level engagement that we often work with, and I think that requires some thought. In terms of grievance mechanisms, this isn't something I've worked with directly myself, but I think I would go straight to the UN Guiding Principles and look at the effectiveness criteria for operational grievance mechanisms, and use that as my framing for how I would talk to a company about grievance mechanisms in the context of AI. I find that list of effectiveness criteria extremely useful whenever we're working with companies on grievance mechanisms more broadly.
Perfect. We have one last question now from Mary Beth. She's asking about just transition and the jobs that are being replaced by automation and technology. So the question is, you know, how widespread is this issue, and how does this impact vulnerable workers, and what should our expectations of the companies be around automation of jobs and just transition for workers?
Yeah, really good question. And in some ways, there's a whole sort of work stream around that question that sometimes is separate from the whole work stream around artificial intelligence and human rights. And I feel like the two could be sort of brought together more closely. I think we need to, so I'm going to share some sort of policy jargon, but think about the social contract, right? What is the role of business? What is the role of government? What is the role of the education system in redesigning the social contract we have for a very different employment setting that we're going to increasingly become familiar with in the 21st century compared to now. So companies have a huge role to play when it comes to reskilling, when it comes to providing different career paths for employees, when it comes to the public policy positioning they take in terms of what they would like to see the education system be. But governments have a role, individual citizens have a role. I think there's an important question to be asked around the future of the social contract. We're going to be publishing a report in the next couple of months looking very specifically at the impact of artificial intelligence and automation on women and women in the workforce. And so that's going to explore that issue in quite a lot of depth. And I think what's expected is for companies to be very deliberate about this, right? This isn't something to ignore, this is something to be very deliberate about. So what is the impact of automation and AI on the jobs in my company, the jobs of the future in my company, the jobs across our value chain, and what does that mean for the education system, for the skills that we might need to be training people in? I think it needs sort of very deliberate management as distinct from something you sort of address as you go along. But if there's interest in resources, we'll be publishing a report in a couple of months looking in particular at the impact of automation on women in the workplace.
Great. Well, looking forward to that publication. I don't know, Danielle, if there's anything else you'd like to say. We have about 3 minutes left, so really just maybe wrap up and move on to the next.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Paloma. So first of all, I would like to thank Dunstan, of course, for the great insights into AI technology companies, but also beyond. It's been very helpful, and I think we have some good pointers that we can use as investors to further develop our approach. Maybe also to mention to the broader group on the phone that we are engaging actively the ICT sector on human rights due diligence, where AI could also be discussed. So if people are interested in that, please reach out to Paloma. I'm, for example, leading on some companies, but there's a broader group of investors that are actively engaging these companies in the coming months. So happy to have anybody else on board there. Yeah, I think it's been very helpful, at least for me, to hear a little bit of how this works in practice and what are the things we really should look out for, going beyond the normal questions we ask about policies, risk management systems, really knowing which topics we should address with companies and see what comes back as a response. Unfortunately, a lot of questions are still also in the unknown. That was expected, I think. Yeah, but I think it's been great and very insightful for us to discuss this with you today, Dunstan. Thanks so much.
No, thank you. It's a pleasure. And that point about the unknown is essential. I would encourage everybody to be active participants in this because norms are being established now, and that's the time to be thoughtful and creative. So thank you very much for putting this on. I think it's a super important discussion, and I'm very glad to see so many people engaged in these issues. So I wish you every success.
Great. Well, thanks to all of you, to everyone on the line for joining us today. Maybe just Mary, if you could go to the final slide. Just 2 quick last points from me before ending the call. For those of you on the line who haven't yet become members of the Investor Alliance and are interested in becoming, please do contact me. I'm happy to share more with you all about this work that we're doing on ICT in particular and more broadly. And the second piece related to that is next week, June 6th, we will be having another webinar on issues related to ICT, and that's going to be on the 2019 findings of the Ranking Digital Rights Index. So look out for that. And I think with that, I'll just once again thank the panelists, thank Dunstan, thank Danielle for really taking the time to speak with us today. I think this has been an incredibly helpful and enlightening conversation, lots to follow up on. So on that note, look out for an email coming soon. And yeah, have a great weekend ahead of you.